Part 3, which is page 67. I looked at him, lost in astonishment. There he was before me, in motley, as though he had absconded from a troupe of mimes. Enthusiastic, fabulous. His very existence was improbable, inexplicable, and altogether bewildering. It was an insoluble problem. It was inconceivable how he had existed, but how he had succeeded in getting so far, how he had managed to remain, why he did not instantly disappear. I went a little farther, he said, then still a little farther, till I had gone so far that I don't know how I'll ever get back. Never mind, plenty time, I can manage. You take Kurtz away quick, quick, I'll tell you. I tell you. The glamour of youth enveloped his party-colored rags, his destitution, his loneliness, the essential desolation of his futile wanderings. For months, for years, his life hadn't been worth a day's purchase, and there he was, gallantly, thoughtlessly alive, to all appearance indestructible solely by the virtue of his few years and of his unreflecting audacity. I was seduced into something like admiration, like envy. Glamour urged him on. Glamour kept him unscathed. He surely wanted nothing from the wilderness but space to breathe in and to push on through. His need was to exist and to move onwards at the greatest possible risk and with the maximum of privation. If the absolutely pure, uncalculating, unpractical spirit of adventure had ever ruled a human being, it ruled this bepatched youth. I almost envied him the possession of his modest and clear flame. It seemed to have consumed all thought of self so completely that even while he was talking to you, you forgot that it was he, the man before your eyes, who had gone through these things. I did not envy him his devotion to Kurtz, though. He had not meditated over it. It came to him and he accepted it with a sort of eager fatalism. I must say that to me, it appeared about the most dangerous thing in every way he had come upon so far. They had come together unavoidably, like two ships becalmed near each other, and lay rubbing sides at last. I suppose Kurtz wanted an audience, because on a certain occasion when encamped in the forest they had talked all night, or more probably Kurtz had talked. We talked of everything, he said, quite transported at that recollection. I forgot there was such a thing as sleep. The night did not seem to last an hour. Everything, of love too. Oh, I talk to you of love, said, much amused. It isn't what you think, he cried almost passionately. It was in general. He made me see things. He threw his arms up. We were on deck at the time, and the head man of my woodcutters lounging nearby turned upon him his heavy and glittering eyes. I looked around and I don't know why, but I was assure you that never before did this land, this river, this jungle, and the very arch of this blazing sky appeared to me so hopeless, so dark, so impenetrable to human thought, so pitiless to human weakness. And ever since you have been with him, of course, I said. On the contrary, it appears their intercourse was very much broken by various causes. He had, as he informed me proudly, managed to nurse Kurtz through 2 illnesses. You spoke of it as you would of some risky achievement, but as a rule, Kurtz wandered alone far in the depths of the forest. Very often coming to this station, I had to wait days and days for him to turn up. He said, it was worth waiting for sometimes. What was he doing, exploring or what, I asked. So yes, of course, he had discovered lots of villages, a lake too. He did not know exactly in what direction. It was dangerous to inquire too much, but mostly his expeditions had been for ivory. But he had no goods to trade with by that time, I objected. There's a good lot of cartridges left even yet, he answered, looking away. To speak plainly, he raided the country, I said. He nodded. Not alone, surely, he muttered, something about villages around that lake. Kurtz got the tribe to follow him, did he? I suggested. He fidgeted a little. They adored him, he said. The tone of these words was so extraordinary that I looked at him searchingly. It was curious to see his mingled eagerness and reluctance to speak of Kurtz. The man filled his life, occupied his thoughts, swayed his emotions. What can you expect, he burst out. He came to them with thunder and lightning, and they had never seen anything like that. And very terrible. He could be very terrible. You can't judge Mr. Kurtz as you would any ordinary man. No. Now, just to give you an idea, I don't mind telling you he wanted to shoot me too one day, but I don't judge him. Shoot you, I cried. What for? Well, I had a small lot of ivory the chief of that village near my house gave me. You see, I used to shoot game for them while he wanted it and wouldn't hear reason. He said he would shoot me unless I gave him the ivory and cleared out of the country, because he could do so and had a fancy for it, and there was nothing on earth to prevent him killing whom he jolly well pleased. And it was true too. I gave him the ivory. What did I care? But I didn't clear out. No, I couldn't leave him. I had to be careful though for the time. Then we got friendly as before. He had his second illness then. Afterwards I had to keep out of the way again, but he was mostly living in those villages on the lake. When he came down to the river, sometimes he would take me. And sometimes I had to keep out of his way, just as it happened. This man suffered too much. He hated all this, and somehow he couldn't get away. When I had a chance, I begged him to try and leave while there was time. I offered to go back with him, and he would say yes, and then he would remain, go off on another ivory hunt, disappear for weeks, forget himself amongst these people, forget himself, you know? Why? He's mad, I said. He protested indignantly. Mr. Kurtz couldn't be mad. If I had heard him talk only 2 days ago, I wouldn't dare hint at such a thing. I had taken up my binoculars while we talked and was looking at the shore, sweeping the limit of the forest at each side and at the back of the house. The consciousness of there being people in that bush, so silent and quiet as a ruined house on the hill, made me uneasy. There was no sign on the face of nature of this amazing tale of cruelty and greed that was not so much told as suggested to me in desolate exclamations, completed by shrugs and interrupted phrases and hints ending in deep sighs. The woods were unmoved like a mask, heavy like the closed door of a prison. They looked with their air of hidden knowledge, of patient expectation, of unapproachable silence. The house came into the range of the glass. The Russian was telling me that it was only lately that Mr. Kurtz had come down to the river, bringing along with him that lake tribe. He had been away for several months, getting himself adored, I suppose, and came down purposing a raid either across the river or down the stream. Evidently, the appetite for more ivory had got the better of the, what shall I say, less material aspirations. However, he had got much more worse suddenly. I heard he was lying helpless, and so I came up, took my chance to the Russian. Oh, he is bad, very bad. I kept my glass steadily on the house. There were no signs of life, but there was the ruined roof, the long mud wall peeping above the grass, with 3 little square window holes, not 2 of the same size. All this brought within reach of my hand, as it were, and then I had made a brusque movement, and one of the remaining posts of that vanished fence leaped up in the field of my glass. You remember I told you I had been struck at the distance by certain attempts at ornamentation, rather remarkable in the ruinous neglect of the place. Now I had suddenly a nearer view, and its first result was to make me throw my head back as if before a blow. Then I went carefully from post to post with my glass, and I saw my mistake. These round knobs were not ornamental, but symbolic. They were symbolic of some cruel and forbidden knowledge. They were expressive and puzzling, striking and disturbing. Food for thought, and also for the vultures, if there had been any looking down from the sky, but at all events for such ants as were industrious enough to ascend the pole. It would have been even more impressive, those heads on the stakes, if their faces had not been turned to the house. Only one, the first I had made out, was facing my way. I was not so shocked as you may think. The start back I had given was really nothing but a movement of surprise. I had expected to see a knob of wood in there, or to see a knob of wood there, you know. I returned deliberately to the first I had seen, and there it was, black, dried, sunken, with closed eyelids, a head that seemed to sleep at the top of the pole, and with the shrunken dry lips showing a narrow white line of the teeth, was smiling too, smiling continuously at some endless and jocose dream of that eternal slumber. And jocose, Jocose, dream of that eternal slumber, eternal sleep. I'm not disclosing any trade secrets. In fact, the manager said afterwards that Mr. Kurtz had ruined that district. I have no opinion as to that, but I want you to clearly to understand that there was nothing profitable in these heads being there. They only showed that Mr. Kurtz lacked restraint in the gratification of his various lusts, that there was something wanting in him, some small matter which, when the pressing need arose, could not be found under his magnificent eloquence. Whether he knew of this deficiency himself, I can't say. I think the knowledge came to him at last, only at the very last, but the wilderness had found him out early, and had taken on him a terrible vengeance for the fantastic invasion. It had tempted him with all the sinister suggestions of his loneliness. I think it had whispered to him things about himself which he did not know, things of which he had no conception till he took counsel with this great solitude. And the whisper had proved irresistibly fascinating. It echoed loudly within him because he was hollow at the core. I put down the glass, and the head that had appeared near enough to be spoken to seemed at once to have leaped away from me into the illusion of an inaccessible distance. The admirer of Mr. Kurtz hung his head. With a hurried, indistinct voice, he began to tell me he had not dared to take these symbols down. He was not afraid of the natives. They would not move till Mr. Kurtz gave the word. His ascendancy was extraordinary. The camps of these people surrounded the place, and the chiefs came every day to see him. They crawled. I don't want to know anything of the ceremonies used when approaching Mr. Kurtz, I shouted. Curious, this feeling that came over me that those details would be more intolerable to hear than those heads drying on stakes under Mr. Kurtz's windows were to see. After all, that was only a savage sight, while I seemed at one bound to have been transported into some lightless region of subtle horrors where pure, uncomplicated savagery was a positive relief, being something that had a right to exist, obviously, in the sunshine. The young man looked at me with surprise. I suppose it did not occur to him Mr. Kurtz was no idol of mine. He forgot I hadn't heard any of these splendid monologues on, what was it, on love, justice, conduct of life, or whatnot. If it had come to crawling before Mr. Kurtz, he crawled as much as the veriest savage of them all. I had no idea of the conditions, he said. These heads were the heads of rebels. I shocked him excessively by laughing. Rebels? What would be the next definition I was to hear? There had been enemies, criminals, workers, and these were rebels. Those rebellious heads looked very pacific, or very pacific to me on their sticks. You don't know how such a life tries a man like Kurtz. You don't know how much a life tries a man like Kurtz, cried Kurtz's last disciple. Well, and you, I said, I am a simple man. I have no great thoughts. I want nothing from anybody. How can you compare me to? His feelings were too much for speech, and suddenly he broke down. I don't understand, he groaned. I've been doing my best to keep him alive, and that's enough. I had no hand in all this. I have no abilities. There hasn't been a drop of medicine or a mouthful of invalid food for months here. He was shamefully abandoned, a man like this with such ideas. Shamefully. I haven't slept for the last 10 nights. His voice lost itself in the calm of the evening. The long shadows of the forest had slipped downhill while we talked. Had gone far beyond the ruined hovel, beyond the symbolic row of stakes. Okay, hold on. Let me pause real quick. All this was in the gloom, while we down there were yet in the sunshine, and the stretch of river abreast of the clearing glittered in a still and dazzling splendor, with a murky and overshadowed band above and below. Not a living soul was seen on the shore. The bushes did not rustle. Suddenly around the corner of the house a group of men appeared. It was as though they had come up from the ground. They waded waist deep in the grass, in a compact body bearing an improvised stretcher in their midst. Instantly, in the emptiness of the landscape, a cry arose whose shrillness pierced the still air like a sharp arrow flying straight to the very heart of the land. And as if by enchantment, streams of human beings, of naked human beings, with spears in their hands, with bows, with shields, with glances and savage movements, were poured into the clearing by the dark face and pensive forest. The bushes shook, the grass swayed for a time, and then everything stood still in attentive immobility. Now, if he does not speak to them, we are all done for, said the Russian at my elbow. The knot of men with the stretcher had stopped too, halfway to the steamer, as if petrified. I saw the men on the stretcher sit up, lank and with an uplifted arm above the shoulders of the bearers. Let us hope that the man who can talk so well of love in general will find some particular reason to spare us his time, I said. I resented bitterly the absurd danger of our situation, as if to be at the mercy of the atrocious phantom who ruled this land had been a dishonoring necessity. I could not hear anything, but through my glasses I saw the thin arm extended commandingly, the lower jaw moving, the eyes of that apparition shining darkly far in his bony head that nodded with grotesque jerks. Kurtz, that means short in German. Don't it? Well, the name was as true as everything else in his life and death. He looked at least 7 feet long. His covering had fallen off, and his body emerged from it pitiful and appalling as from a winding sheet. I could see the cage of his ribs all astir, the bones of his arm waving. It was as though an animated image of death carved out of old ivory had been shaking its hand with menaces at a motionless crowd of men made of dark and glittering bronze. I saw him open his mouth wide. It gave him a weirdly voracious aspect, as though he had wanted to swallow all the air, all the earth, all the men before him. A deep sound reached me faintly. He must have been shouting. He fell back suddenly. The stretcher shook at the bearers, staggered forward again, and almost at the same time I noticed that the crowd of savages had already diminished, was vanishing without any perceptible movement of retreat, as if the forest that had ejected these beings so suddenly had drawn them in again as a breath is drawn in a long aspiration. Some of the pilgrims behind the stretcher carried his arms, 2 shotguns, a heavy rifle, and a light revolver carbine, the thunderbolts of that pitiful Jupiter. The manager bent over him, murmuring as he walked beside his head. They laid him down in one of the little cabins, just a room for a bed place and a camp stool or two, you know. We had brought his belated correspondence, and a lot of torn envelopes and open letters littered his bed. His hand roamed feebly amongst these papers. I was struck by the fire of his eyes and the composed languor of his expression. It was not so much the exhaustion of disease. He did not seem in pain. This shadow looked satiated. and calm, as though for the moment it had had its fill of all the emotions. He rustled one of the letters and looking into my face said, "I am glad somebody had been writing to him about me, these special recommendations again." The volume of tone he emitted without effort, almost without the trouble of moving his lips, amazed me. A voice, it was grave, profound, vibrating, while the man did not seem capable of a whisper. However, he had enough strength in him, factitious no doubt, to very nearly make an end of us, as you shall hear directly. The manager appeared in the doorway, so I stepped out at once, and he drew the curtain after me. The Russian, eyed curiously by the pilgrims, was staring at the shore. I followed the direction of his glance. Several bronze figures could be made out in the distance, moving indistinctly against the gloomy border of the forest. And near the river, two were standing leaning on spears in the sunlight, under fantastic headdresses of spotted skins, warlike and still in statuesque repose. And from right to left along the lighted shore moved a wild and gorgeous apparition of a woman. She walked with measured steps, draped in striped and fringed clothes, treading the earth proudly with a slight jingle and a flash of barbarous ornaments. She carried her head high, her hair was done in the shape of a helmet. She had brass leggings to the knee, brass wire gauntlets to the elbow, a crimson spot on her tawny cheek, innumerable necklaces of glass beads on her neck, bizarre things, charms, gifts of witch men that hung about her, glittered and trembled at every step. She must have had the value of several elephant tusks upon her. She was savage and superb, wild-eyed and magnificent. There was something ominous and stately in her deliberate progress, and in the hush that had fallen suddenly upon the whole sorrowful land, the immense wilderness, the colossal body of the fecund, F-E-C-U-N-D, and mysterious life seemed to look at her as though it had been looking at the image of its own tenebrous, Tenebrous, and passionate soul. Tenebrous, and passionate soul. And we men also looked at her. At any rate, I looked at her. She came abreast of the steamer, stood still and faced us. Her long shadow fell to the water's edge. Her face had a tragic and fierce aspect of wild sorrow and of dumb fear mingled with the pain of a struggling, half-shaped emotion. She stood looking at us without a stir, and like the wilderness itself, with an air of brooding over an inscrutable purpose. A whole minute passed, and then she made a step forward. There was a low jingle, a glint of yellow metal, a sway of fringed draperies, and she stopped. Had her heart failed her, or had her eyes, veiled with that mournfulness that lies over all the wild things of the earth, seen the hopelessness of longing that will find out sometimes even a savage soul in the lonely darkness of its being? Who can tell? Perhaps she did not know herself. The young fellow by my side growled. The pilgrims murmured at my back. She looked at us all as if her life depended upon the unswerving steadiness of her glance. Suddenly she opened her bared arms and threw them up rigid above her head, as though in an uncontrollable desire to touch the sky, and at the same time the shadows of her arms darted out on earth, swept around on the river, gathering the streamer into a shadowy embrace. Her sudden gesture seemed to demand a cry, but the unbroken silence that hung over the scene was more formidable than any sound could be. She turned, walked on, following the bank, and passed into the bushes to the left. Once only her eyes gleamed back at us in the dusk of the thickets, and she disappeared. If she had offered to come aboard, I think I would have tried to shoot her, said the man of patches nervously. I had been risking my life every day for the last fortnight to keep her out of the house. She got in once and kicked up a row about those miserable rags I picked up in the storm room to mend my clothes with. I was not decent. At least it must have been that, for she talked to Kurtz for an hour, pointing at me now and then. I don't understand the dialect of this tribe. Luckily for me, Kurtz felt too ill that day to care, or there would have been mischief. I don't understand. No, it's too much for me. Well, it's all over now. At this moment, I heard Kurtz's deep voice behind the curtain. Save me. Save the ivory, you mean. Don't tell me. Save me. Why, I've had to save you. You are interrupting my plans now. Sick, not so sick as you would like to believe. Never mind. I'll carry my ideas out yet. I will return. I'll show you what can be done. You with your little peddling notions, you are interfering with me. I will return. The manager came out. He did me the honor to take me under the arm and lead me inside. He was very low, he said. He considered it necessary to sigh, but forgot to be consistently sorrowful. We have done all we could for him, haven't we? But there is no disguising the fact. Mr. Kurtz has done more harm than good to the company. He did not see the time. He was not ripe for vigorous action. Cautiously, that's my principle. We must be cautious yet. The district is close to us for a time, deplorable. Upon the whole, the trade will suffer. I don't deny there is a remarkable quantity of ivory, mostly fossil. We must save it at all events, but look how precarious the position is, and why. because the method is unsound. Do you, said I, looking at the shore, call it unsound method? Without doubt, he exclaimed hotly. Don't you? No method at all, I murmured, exactly exalted. I anticipated this, a complete want of judgment. It is my duty to point it out in the proper quarter. Oh, said I, that fellow, what's his name? The brickmaker? The brickmaker will make a readable report for you. He appeared confounded for a moment. It seemed to me I had never breathed an atmosphere so vile, and I turned mentally to Kurtz for relief, positively for relief. Or looked to Kurtz for relief, positively for relief. Nevertheless, I think Mr. Kurtz is a remarkable man, I said with emphasis. He started, dropped on me a cold, heavy glance, said very quietly, he was, and turned his back on me. My hour of favor was over. I found myself lumped along with Kurtz as a partisan of methods for which the time was not ripe. I was unsound, but it was something to have at least a choice of nightmares. I had turned to the wilderness, really, not to Mr. Kurtz, who I was ready to admit was as good as buried, and for a moment it seemed to me as if I also were buried in a vast grave full of unspeakable secrets. I felt an intolerable weight oppressing my breast, the smell of the damp earth, the unseen presence of victorious corruption, the darkness of an impenetrable night. The Russian tapped me on the shoulder. I heard him mumbling and stammering something about brother Seaman, couldn't conceal knowledge of matters that would affect Mr. Kurtz's reputation. I waited. For him, evidently, Mr. Kurtz was not in his grave. I suspect that for him, Mrs. Kurtz was one of the immortals. Well, said I at last, speak out. As it happens, I am Mr. Kurtz's friend, in a way. He stated with a good deal of formality that had we not been of the same profession, he would have kept the matter to himself without regard to consequences. He suspected there was an active ill will towards him on the part of these white men. That you are right, I said, remembering a certain conversation I had overheard. The manager thinks you ought to be hanged. He showed a concern at this intelligence which astonished me at first. I had better get out of the way quietly, he said earnestly. I can do no more for Kurtz now, and they would soon find a pretext. What's to stop them? There's a military post 300 miles from here. Well, upon my word, said I, perhaps you had better go if you have any friends amongst the savages nearby. Plenty, he said. They are simple people, and I want nothing, you know. He stood biting his lip then. I don't want any harm to happen to these whites here, but of course I was thinking of Mr. Kurtz's reputation, but you are a brother seaman, and... All right, said I after a time. Mr. Kurtz's reputation is safe for me. I did not know how truly I spoke. He informed me, lowering his voice, that it was Kurtz who had ordered the attack to be made on the steamer. He hated sometimes the idea of being taken away, and then again, but I don't understand these matters. I am a simple man. He thought it would scare you away, that you would give it up, thinking him dead. I could not stop him. Oh, I had an awful time of it last month. Very well, I said. He is all right now. Yes, he muttered, not very convinced apparently. Thanks, said I. I shall keep my eyes open, but quiet, eh? He urged anxiously. It would be awful for his reputation if anybody here. I promised a complete discretion with great gravity. I have a canoe and 3 black fellows not very far. I am off. Could you give me a few Martini Henry cartridges? I could and did with proper secrecy. He helped himself with a wink at me to a handful of my tobacco. Between sailors, you know, good English tobacco. At the door of the pilot house, he turned around. I say, haven't you a pair of shoes you could spare? He raised one leg. Look, the soles were tied with knotted strings, sandal-wise, under his bare feet. I rooted out an old pair at which he looked with admiration before tucking them under his left arm. One of his pockets, bright red, was bulging with cartridges. From the other, dark blue, peeped Towson Inquiry, etc., etc. He seemed to think himself excellency well equipped for a renewed encounter with the wilderness. He seemed to think of himself excellently well equipped for a renewed encounter with the... I'll never meet such a man again. You ought to have heard him recite poetry. His own too it was, he told me. Poetry. His own too, he told me, poetry. He rolled his eyes at the recollection of these delights. Oh, he enlarged my mind. Goodbye, said I. He shook hands and vanished in the night. I asked myself whether I had ever really seen him, whether it was possible to meet such a phenomenon. When I woke up shortly after midnight, his warning came to my mind with its hint of danger that seemed in the starred darkness, real enough to make me get up for the purpose of having a look around. On the hill, a big fire burned, illuminating fitfully a crooked corner of the station house. One of the agents, with a picket of a few of our blacks, armed for the purpose, was keeping guard. But deep within the forest, red gleams that wavered, that seemed to sink and rise from the ground amongst confused columnar shapes of intense blackness, showed the exact position of the camp where Mr. Kurtz's adorers were keeping their uneasy vigil. The monotonous beating of a big drum filled the air with muffled shocks and a lingering vibration. A steady droning sound of many men chanting each to himself some weird incantation came out from the black, flat wall of the woods as the humming of bees comes out of a hive, and had a strange narcotic effect upon my half-awake senses. I believe I dozed off, leaning over the rail, till an abrupt burst of yowls, an overwhelming outbreak of a pent-up and mysterious frenzy woke me up in a bewildered wonder. It was cut short all at once, and the low droning went on with an effect of audible and soothing silence. I glanced casually into the little cabin. A light was burning. Kurtz was not there. I think I would have raised an outcry if I had believed my eyes, but I didn't believe them at first. The thing seemed so impossible. The fact is, I was completely unnerved. Sheer blank fright, pure abstract terror, unconnected with any distinct shape of physical danger. What made this emotion so overpowering was, how shall I define it, the moral shock I received, as if something altogether monstrous, intolerable to thought, odious to the soul, had been thrust upon me unexpectedly. This lasted, of course, the merest fraction of a second, and then the usual sense of commonplace, deadly danger, the possibility of a sudden onslaught and massacre or something of the kind, which I saw impending, was positively welcome and composing. It pacified me, in fact, and I did not raise an alarm. There was an agent buttoned up inside an ulster, sleeping on a chair on a deck within 3 feet of me. All right, I'm gonna pause because there's somebody gonna creep up, right? But I'm on page 79. I'm glad I'm gonna finish this book. Pretty sure I'm gonna finish it today, so. And it's a hella boring book, so I'm glad I'm gonna finish it. Get it done. Got about 14 pages. I think I lost my spot. Let me find it. There was an agent buttoned up inside an ulster, sleeping on a chair on deck within 3 feet of me. The yells had not awakened him, and he snored very slightly. I left him to his slumbers and leaped ashore. I did not betray Mr. Kurtz. It was ordered I should never betray him. It was written I should be loyal to the nightmare of my choice. I was anxious to deal with this shadow by myself alone, and to this day I don't know why I was so jealous of sharing with anyone the dismal blackness of this experience. As soon as I got on the bank, I saw a broad trail through the grass. I remember the exultation with which I said to myself, "He can't walk, he is crawling, I've got him." The grass was wet with dew. I strode rapidly with clenched fist. I fancy I had some vague notion of falling upon him and giving him a drubbing. D-R-U-B-B-I-N-G. I don't know, I had some imbecile thoughts. The knitting old woman with the cat obtruded herself upon me as a most improper person to be sitting at the other end of such an affair. Somebody with a loud car next to me. I don't know if you guys heard it. I saw a row of pilgrims squirting lead in the air out of Winchesters held to the hip. I thought I would never get back to the steamer, and saw myself living alone and unarmed in the woods to an advanced age. Such silly things, you know, and I remember I confounded the beat of the drum with the beating of my heart and was pleased at its calm regularity. I kept to the track though, then stopped to listen. The night was very clear, a dark blue space, sparkling with dew and starlight, where black things stood very still. I thought I saw a kind of motion ahead of me. I was strangely cocksure of everything that night. I actually left that track and ran in a wide semicircle. I verily believed, chuckling to myself, so as to get in front of that stir of that motion I had seen. If indeed I had seen anything, I was circumventing Kurtz as if it had been a boyish game for fun. I came upon him, and if he had not heard me coming, I would have fallen over him too, but he got up in time in front of me. He rose, unsteady, long, pale, indistinct, like a vapor exhaled by the earth, and swayed slightly misty and silent before me, while at my back the fires loomed between the trees, and the murmur of many voices issued from the forest. Oh shit, oh shit, oh damn. Oh shit. Oh shit, what's up, dude? You were playing basketball with me, huh? Hey, bro. I'm gonna tell you just so you don't be fucking here for too long. But I ain't gonna say who did it, because it could be that guy. But when I came out, somebody stole your shit underneath your car, dog. Yeah, the thing that connects to your exhaust. Underneath the car. There's probably a pipe, and you can tell that it's cut. Yeah or not?
I can't tell, but it sounds loud, huh? You can hear it?
I thought it was this car, because I'm reading in my car. I thought it was this car right here, because it's like a nice fast car. And I kept hearing somebody turn it off and on. And I remember I came out and I see somebody jacking something. So somebody stole, because there's something called a catalytic converter.
Yeah, but that's in the back. That's why I was checking the back.
They stole something, huh? I ain't gonna say who did it, but they stole something from somebody's car, and because you know I ain't gonna say who it was, but
Well, you know who it was.
nah, I mean, what happened?
They have a hammer right there.
Yeah, you got to do all that. You got to figure that out. But I'm letting you know that it's something that it's something. All right. The more I'm here, I'm probably gonna end up saying who it was, but they could be looking from somewhere. But I ain't gonna snitch. I don't want to be snitching on nobody, you know. But somebody walk by with a mask, all sketchy. It could be like a sketchy ass system right here, you know. I had cut him off, but if I didn't snitch. You guys heard it, right? I just had to let him know somebody jacked his shit. I was playing basketball with him in the gym right now. It was only him and I, and like, because that's why I left the gym. Isn't it weird? Totally weird, bro. Okay, so he's gonna talk to Mr. Kurtz right now. I'll just read from the middle of page 80. I came upon him, and if he had not heard me coming, I would have fallen over him too, but he got up in time in front of me. He rose unsteady, long, pale, and distinct, like a vapor exhaled by the earth, and swayed slightly, misty and silent before me, while at my back the fires loomed between the trees, and the murmur of many voices issued from the forest. I cut him off cleverly, but when actually confronting him, I seemed to come to my senses. I saw the danger in its right proportion. It was by no means over yet. Suppose he began to shout, though he could hardly stand there. Was still plenty of vigor in his voice. Go away, hide yourself, he said in that profound tone. It was very awful. I glanced back. We were within 30 yards from the nearest fire. A black figure stood up, strode on long black legs, waving long black arms across the glow. It had horns, antelope horns, I think, on its head. Some sorcerer, some witchman, no doubt. It looked fiend-like enough. Do you know what you are doing? I whispered. Perfectly, he answered, raising his voice for that single word. It sounded to me far off and yet loud, like a hail through a speaking trumpet. If he makes a row, we are lost, I thought to myself. This clearly was not a case for fisticuffs. Even apart from the very natural aversion I had to beat that shadow, this wandering and tormented thing that seemed released from one grave only to sink forever into another. You will be lost, I said, utterly lost. One gets sometimes such a flash of inspiration, you know. I did say the right thing, though indeed he could not have been more irretrievably lost than he was at this very moment, when the foundations of our intimacy were being laid to endure even to the end, even beyond. I had immense plans, he muttered irresolutely. Yes, said I, but if you try to shout, I'll smash your head with. There was not a stick or a stone here. I will throttle you for good, I corrected myself. I was on the threshold of great things, he pleaded in a voice of longing with a wistfulness of tone that made my blood run cold. And now for this stupid scoundrel, your success in Europe is assured in any case, I affirmed steadily. I did not want to have the throttling of him, you understand? And indeed, it would have been very little use for any practical purpose. I tried to break the spell, the heavy mute spell of the wilderness that seemed to draw him to its pitiless breast by the awakening of forgotten and brutal instincts, by the memory of gratified and monstrous passions. This alone, I was convinced, had driven him out to the edge of the forest, to the bush, towards the gleam of fires, the throb of drums, the drone of weird incantations. This alone had beguiled his unlawful soul beyond the bounds of permitted aspirations. And don't you see, the terror of the position was not in being knocked on the head, though I had a very lively sense of that danger too. But in this, that I had to deal with a being to whom I could not appeal in the name of anything high or low. I had even like the N-words to invoke him himself, his own exalted and incredible degradation. There was nothing either above or below him, and I knew it. He had kicked himself loose of the earth. Confound the man, he had kicked the very earth to pieces. He was alone, and I before him did not know whether I stood on the ground or floated in the air. I've been telling you what we said, repeating the phrases we've pronounced. But what's the good? They were common, everyday words, the familiar, vague sounds exchanged on every waking day of life. But what of that? They had behind them, to my mind, the terrific suggestiveness of words heard in dreams, of phrases spoken in nightmares. Soul, if anybody had ever struggled with the soul, I am the man, and I wasn't arguing with the man either. Believe me or not, his intelligence was perfectly clear, concentrated. It is true upon himself, with horrible intensity, yet clear, and therein was my only chance, barring, of course, the killing him there and then, which wasn't so good on account of unavoidable noise, but his soul was mad. Being alone in the wilderness, it had looked within itself, and by heavens, I tell you, had gone mad. I had for my sins, I suppose, to go through the ordeal of looking into itself. No eloquence could have been so withering as his final burst of sincerity. He struggled with himself, too. I saw it. I heard it. I saw the inconceivable mystery of a soul that knew no restraint, no faith, and no fear, yet struggling blindly with itself. I kept my head pretty well, but when I had him at last stretched on the couch, I wiped my forehead while my legs shook under me as though I'd carried half a ton on my back down that hill. And yet I had only supported him, his bony arm clasped round my neck, and he was not much heavier than a child. And when next day we left at noon, the crowd of whose presence behind the curtain of trees I had been acutely conscious all the time, flowed out of the woods again, filled the clearing, covered the slope with a mass of naked, breathing, quivering bronze bodies. I steamed up a bit, then swung downstream, and 2,000 eyes followed the evolutions of the splashing, thumping, fierce river demon beating the water with its terrible tail and breathing black smoke into the air. In front of the first rank along the river, 3 men, plastered with bright red earth from head to toe, strutted to and fro restlessly. When we came abreast again, they faced the river, stamped their feet, nodded their horned heads, swayed their scarlet bodies. They shook towards the same river demon, a bunch of black feathers, a spotted skin with a pendant tail, something that looked like a dried gourd, G-O-U-R-D. They shouted periodically together, strings of amazing words that resemble no sounds of human language. And the deep murmurs of the crowd interrupted suddenly. We were like responses of some satanic litany. We had carried Kurtz into the pilot house. There was more air there. Lying on the couch, he stared through the open shutter. There was an eddy in the mass of black heads, and the women with helmeted head and tawny cheeks rushed out to the very brink of the stream. She put out her hand, shouted something, and all that wild mob took up the shout in an amazing chorus of articulated, rapid, breathless utterance. Do you understand this? I asked. He kept on looking out with fiery, longing eyes with a mingled expression of wistfulness and hate. He did not answer me, but at my question I saw a smile of indefinable meaning appear on his colorless lips that a moment after twitched convulsively with pain or rage. I will return, he said, slowly gasping as if the words of promise and menace had been torn out of him by a supernatural power. I pulled the string of the whistle, and I did this because I saw the pilgrims on deck getting out their rifles with an air of anticipating a jolly lark. At the sudden screech, there was a movement of abject terror through that wedged mass of bodies. Don't, you frighten them away, cried someone on deck disconsolately. I pulled the string again and again. They broke and ran, they leaped, they crouched, they swerved as if dodging the terrible sound. The 3 red chaps had fallen flat, face down on the shore as though they had been shot dead. Only the barbarous and superb woman did not so much as flinch, and stretched tragically her bare arms after us over the brown and glittering river. And then that imbecile crowded down on the deck, started their little fun, and I could see nothing more for smoke. The brown current ran swiftly out of the heart of darkness, bearing us down towards the sea with twice the speed of our upward progress, and Kurt's life was running swiftly too, ebbing out of his heart into the sea of inexorable time. The manager was very placid. He had no vital anxieties now. He took in both of us in a comprehensive and satisfied glance. The affair had come off as well as could be wished. I saw the time approaching when I would be left alone of the party of unsound method. The pilgrims looked upon me with disfavor. I was, so to speak, numbered with the dead. It is strange how I accepted this unforeseen partnership, this choice of nightmares forced upon me in the tenebrous land invaded by these mean and greedy phantoms. Kurtz discoursed, a voice that rang deep to the very last. It survived his strength to hide in the magnificent folds of eloquence the barren darkness of his heart. Oh, he struggled, he struggled. The waste of his weary brain were haunted by shadowy images now, images of wealth and fame revolving obsequiously round his inextinguishable gift of noble and lofty expression. My intended, my station, my career, my ideas, these were the subjects for the occasional utterances of elevated sentiments. The shade of the original Kurtz frequented the bedside of the hollow sham, whose fate was to be buried presently in the mold of primeval earth, but both the diabolical love and the unearthly hate of the mysteries it had penetrated fought for the possession of that soul, satiated with primitive emotions, avid of lying fame, of sham distinction, of all the appearances of success and power. Sometimes he was contemptibly childish. He desired to have kings meet him at railway stations on his return from some ghastly nowhere where he intended to accomplish great things. You show them you have in you something that is really profitable, and then there will be no limits to the recognition of your abilities, he would say. Of course, you must take care of the motives, right motives always. The long reaches that were like one and the same reach, monotonous bends that were exactly alike, slipped past the steamer with their multitude of secular trees, looking patiently after this grimy fragment of another world, the forerunner of change, of conquest, of trade, of massacres, of blessings. I looked ahead, piloting. Close the shutters, said Kurtz suddenly one day. I can't bear to look at this. I did so. There was a silence. Oh, but I will wring your heart yet, he cried at the invisible wilderness. We broke down as I had expected and had to lie out for repairs at the head of an island. This delay was the first thing that shook Kurt's confidence. One morning he gave me a packet of papers and a photograph, the lot tied together with the shoestring. Keep this for me, he said. This noxious fool, meaning the manager, is capable of prying into my boxes when I'm not looking. In the afternoon I saw him. He was lying on his back with closed eyes, and I withdrew quietly, but I heard him mutter, "Live rightly, die, die." I listened. There was nothing more. Was he rehearsing some speech in his sleep, or was it a fragment of a phrase from some newspaper article? He had been writing for the papers and meant to do so again. For the furthering of my ideas, it's a duty. His was an impenetrable darkness. I looked at him as you peer down at a man who was lying at the bottom of a precipice where the sun never shines. But I had not much time to give him because I was helping the engine driver to take to pieces the leaky cylinders, to straighten a bent connecting rod, and in other such matters. I lived in a repulsive mess of nuts, bolts, spanners, hammers, ratchets, things I abominate because I don't get on with him. I tended the little forge we fortunately had aboard. I toiled wearily in a wretched scrap heap unless I had the shakes too bad to stand. One evening, coming in with the candle, I was startled to hear him say a little querulously, Querulously, "I am lying here in the dark, waiting for death." The light was within a foot of his eyes. I managed to murmur, "Oh, nonsense," and stood over him as if transfixed. Anything approaching the expression that came over his face I have never seen before and hope never to see again. Oh, I wasn't touched. I was fascinated. It was as though a veil had been rent. I saw on that ivory face the expression of strange pride, of mental power, of avarice, avarice, of bloodthirstiness, of cunning, of excessive terror, of an intense and hopeless despair. Did he live his life through in every detail of desire, temptation, and surrender during that supreme moment of complete knowledge? He cried whisperingly at some image, at some vision. He cried twice with a cry that was no more than a breath. The horror, the horror. I blew the candle out and left the cabin. The pilgrims were dining in the mess cabin. I have 10 more pages. The pilgrims were dining in the mess cabin. I took my place opposite the manager, who lifted his eyes to give me a questioning glance which I successfully ignored. He leaned back, serene, with that peculiar smile of his sealing the unexpressed depths of his meanness. A continuous shower of small flies streamed upon the lamp, upon the cloth, upon our hands and faces. Suddenly the manager's boy put his insolent black face in the doorway. He said in a tone of scathing contempt, "Mr. Kurtz, he dead." All the pilgrims rushed out to see. I remained and went on with my dinner. I believe I was considered brutally callous. However, I did not eat much. There was a lamp in there, light, don't you know? And outside it was so beastly dark. I went no more near the remarkable man who had so unhesitatingly pronounced a judgment upon the adventures of his soul on this earth. The voice was gone. What else had been there? But I am, of course, aware that the next day the pilgrims buried something in the muddy hole. And then they very nearly buried me. However, as you see, I did not go to join Kurtz there and then. I did not. I remained a dream, the nightmare out to the end. And to show my loyalty to Kurtz once more, destiny, my destiny, droll thing life is. Droll, D-R-O-L-L. Droll thing life is, that mysterious arrangement of merciless logic for a futile purpose. The most you can hope from it is some knowledge of yourself that comes too late, a crop of unextinguishable regrets. I have wrestled with death. It is the most unexciting contest you can imagine. It takes place in an impalpable grayness, with nothing underfoot, with nothing around, without spectators, without clamor, without glory, without the great desire of victory, without the great fear of defeat. Without the great fear of defeat. Sorry guys. Okay. In a sickly atmosphere of tepid skepticism, without much belief in your own right, and still less in that of your adversary. If such is the form of ultimate wisdom, then life is a greater riddle than some of us think it to be. I was within a hair's breadth of the last opportunity for pronouncement, and I found with humiliation that probably I would have nothing to say. That is the reason why I affirmed that Kurtz was a remarkable man. He had something to say. He said it. Since I had peeped over the edge myself, I understand better the meaning of his stare that could not see the flame of the candle, but was wide enough to embrace the whole universe, piercing enough to penetrate all the hearts that beat in the darkness. He had summed up, he had judged the horror. He was a remarkable man. After all, this was the expression of some sort of belief. It had candor, C-A-N-D-O-U-R. It had conviction. It had a vibrating note of revolt. In its whisper, it had the appalling face of a glimpsed truth, a strange commingling of desire and hate. And it is not my own extremity I remember best, a vision of grayness without form, filled with physical pain, and a careless contempt for the evanescence of all things, even of this pain itself. No, it is his extremity that I seemed to have lived through. True, he had made that last stride, he had stepped over the edge, while I had been permitted to draw back my hesitating foot, and perhaps, and this is the whole difference, perhaps all the wisdom and all the truth and all the sincerity are just compressed into that inappreciable moment of time in which we step over the threshold of the invisible. Perhaps I like to think my summing up will not have been a word of careless contempt. Better his cry, much better, was an affirmation, a moral victory paid for by innumerable defeats, by abominable terrors, by abominable satisfactions, but it was a victory. That is why I have remained loyal to Kurtz to the last, and even beyond, when long time after I heard once more, not his own voice, but the echo of his magnificent eloquence, thrown to me from a soul as translucently pure as a cliff of crystal. No, they did not bury me, though there was a period of time which I remembered mistily, with a shuddering wonder, like a passage through some inconceivable world that had no hope in it and no desire. I found myself in the sepulchral, S-E-P-U-L-C-H-R-A-L, the sepulchral city, resenting the sight of people hurrying through the streets to filch, F-I-L-C-H, a little money from each other, or to devour their infamous cookery, to gulp their unwholesome beer, to dream their insignificant, silly dreams. They trespassed upon my thoughts. They were intruders whose knowledge of life was to me an irritating pretense, because I felt so sure they could not possibly know the things I knew, and their bearing, which was simply the bearing of commonplace individuals going about their business in the assurance of perfect safety, was offensive to me, like the outrageous flauntings of folly in the face of a danger it is unable to comprehend. I had no particular desire to enlighten them, but I had some difficulty in restraining myself from laughing in their faces. So full of stupid importance, I dare say I was not very well at the time. I tottered about the streets. There were various affairs to settle, grinning bitterly at the perfectly respectable persons. I admit my behavior was inexcusable, but then my temperature was seldom normal in these days. My dear aunt's endeavors to nurse up my strength seemed altogether beside the mark. It was not my strength that wanted nursing, it was really my imagination that wanted soothing. I kept a bundle of papers given me by Kurtz, not knowing exactly what to do with it. His mother had died lately, watched over, as I was told by his intended. A clean-shaved man with an official manner and wearing gold-rimmed spectacles called on me one day and made inquiries, at first circuitous, afterwards suavely pressing, about what he was pleased to denominate certain documents. I was not very surprised, because I had 2 rows with the manager on the subject out there. I had refused to give up the smallest scrap out of that package to him, and I took the same attitude with the spectacled man. He became darkly menacing at last, and with much heat argued that the company had the right to every bit of information about the territories, and said he, Mr. Kurtz's knowledge of unexplored regions must have been necessarily extensive and peculiar, owing to his great abilities and to the deplorable circumstances in which he had been placed. Therefore, I assured him, Mr. Kurtz's knowledge, however extensive, did not bear upon the problems of commerce or administration. He invoked in the name of the science It would be an incalculable loss if, etc., etc. I offered him to report on the suppression of savage customs with the postscriptum torn off. He took it up eagerly, but ended by sniffing at it with an air of contempt. This is not what we had a right to expect, he marked. Expect nothing else, I said. There are only private letters. He withdrew upon some threat of legal proceedings, and I saw him no more, but another fellow calling himself Kurt's cousin appeared 2 days later and was anxious to hear all the details about his dear relative's last moments. Incidentally, he gave me to understand that Kurtz had been essentially a great musician. There was the making of an immense success, said the man, who was an organist, I believe, with lank gray hair flowing over a greasy coat collar. I had no reason to doubt his statement, and to this day I am unable to say what was Kurt's profession, whether he ever had, which was the greatest of his talents, had any, which was the greatest of his talents. I had thought him a painter who wrote for the papers, or a journalist who could paint, but even the cousin who took snuff during the interview could not tell me what he had been exactly. He was a universal genius. On that point I agreed with the old chap, who thereupon blew his nose noisily into a large cotton handkerchief and withdrew in senile agitation, bearing off some family letters and memoranda without importance. Ultimately, a journalist anxious to know something of the fate of his dear colleague turned up. This visitor informed me Kurt's real sphere ought to have been politics on the popular side. He had fiery straight eyebrows, bristly hair cropped short, an eyeglass on a broad ribbon, and becoming expansive, confessed his opinion that Kurtz couldn't write a bit. But heavens, how that man could talk. He electrified large meetings. He had faith, don't you see? He had faith. He could believe anything, anything. He would have been a splendid leader of an extreme party. What party, I asked. Any party, answered the other. He was an extremist. Did I not think so? I assented. Did I know? He asked with a sudden flash of curiosity. What induced him to go out there? Yes, said I, and forthwith handed him the famous report for publication, if he thought fit. He glanced through it hurriedly, mumbling all the time, judged it would do, and took himself off with his plunder. The letter. Thus I was left at last with a slim packet of letters and the girl's portrait. She struck me as beautiful. I mean, she had a beautiful expression. I know that the sunlight can be made to lie too, yet that face on paper seemed to be a reflection of truth itself. One felt that no manipulation of light and pose could have conveyed the delicate shade of truthfulness upon those features. She looked out truthfully. She seemed ready to listen without mental reservation, without suspicion, without a thought for herself. I concluded I would go and give her back her portrait and those letters myself. Curiosity, yes, and also some other feeling, perhaps. All that had been Kurt's had passed out of my hands: his soul, his body, his station, his plans, his ivory, his career. There remained only his memory and his intended. And I wanted to give that up to the past in a way, to surrender personally all that remained of him with me to that oblivion in which is the last word of our common fate. I don't defend myself. I had no clear perception of what it was I really wanted. Perhaps it was an impulsive unconscious loyalty, or the fulfillment of one of these ironic necessities that lurk in the facts of human existence. I don't know. I can't tell, but I went. I thought his memory was like other memories of the dead that accumulate in every man's life, a vague impress on the brain of shadows that had fallen on it in their swift and final passage. But before the high and ponderous door, between the tall houses of a street as still and decorous as a well-kept sepulchre, I had a vision of him on the stretcher, opening his mouth voraciously as if to devour all the earth with all its mankind. He lived then before me. He lived as much as he had ever lived, a shadow insatiable of splendid appearances, of frightful realities, a shadow darker than the shadow of the night, and the draped nobly in the folds of a gorgeous eloquence. The vision seemed to enter the house with me, the stretcher, the phantom bearers, the wild crowd of obedient worshippers, the gloom of the forest, the glitter of the reach between the murky bends, the beat of the drum, regular and muffled like the beating of a heart, the heart of a conquering darkness. It was a moment of triumph for the wilderness, an invading and vengeful rush which it seemed to me I would have to keep back alone for the salvation of another soul. And the memory of what I had heard him say afar there, with the horn shapes stirring at my back in the glow of fires within the patient woods, those broken phrases came back to me, were heard again in their ominous and terrifying simplicity. I have lived supremely. What do you want here? I have been dead. And damn, let me go. I want more of it. More of what? More blood, more heads on stakes, more adoration, rapine, and murder. I remembered his abject pleading, his abject threats, the colossal scale of his vile desires, the meanness, the torment, the tempestuous anguish of his soul, and later on his collected languid manner when he said one day, "This lot of ivory now is really mine. The company did not pay for it. I collected it myself at personal risk. I'm afraid they will claim it as theirs. It is a difficult case. What do you think I ought to do? Resist? I want no more than justice." He wanted no more than justice, no more than justice. I rang the bell before a mahogany door on the first floor, and while I waited, he seemed to stare at me out of the gleaming panel, stare with that wide and immense stare, embracing, condemning, loathing all the universe. I seemed to hear the whispered cry, the horror, the horror. The dust was falling. I had to wait in a lofty drawing room with 3 long windows from floor to ceiling that were like 3 luminous and bed-draped columns. The bent gilt legs and backs of the furniture shone in indistinct curves. The tall marble fireplace had a cold and heavy whiteness. A grand piano stood massively in a corner with dark gleams on the flat surfaces like a somber and polished sarcophagus. Sarcophagus. A high door opened, closed. I rose. She came forward, all in black, with a pale head floating towards me in the dust. She was in mourning. It was more than a year since his death, more than a year since the news came. She seemed as though she would remember and mourn forever. She took both my hands in hers and murmured, "I had heard you were coming." I noticed she was not very young. I mean, not girlish. She had a mature capacity for fidelity, for belief, for suffering. The room seemed to have grown darker, as if all the sad light of the cloudy evening had taken refuge on her forehead. This fair hair, this pale visage, visage, this visage, this pure brow seemed surrounded by an ashy halo from which the dark eyes looked out at me. Their glance was guileless, profound, confident, trustful. She carried her sorrowful head as though she were proud of that sorrow, as though she would say, I alone know how to mourn for him as he deserves." But while we were still shaking hands, such a look of awful desolation came upon her face that I perceived she was one of those creatures that are not the playthings of time. For her, he had died only yesterday, and by Hove. The impression was so powerful that for me to be, he seemed to have died only yesterday. For me to, nay, this very minute, I saw her and him in the same instant of time. His death and her sorrow. I saw her sorrow in the very moment of his death. It was too terrible. It was too terrible. "Do you understand? I saw them together. I heard them together," she had said, with a deep catch of breath. I have survived, while my strained ears seemed to hear distinctly, mingled with her tone of despairing regret, the summing up whisper of his eternal condemnation. I tell you, it was terrible. I asked myself what I was doing there, with a sensation of panic in my heart, as though I had blundered into a place of cruel and absurd mysteries, not fit for a human being to behold. I wanted to get out. She motioned me to a chair. We sat down. I laid the packet gently on the little table, and she put her hand over it. "You know him well," she murmured after a moment of mourning silence. "Intimacy grows quick out there," I said. "I knew him as well as it's possible for one man to know another." "And you admired him," she said. "It was impossible to know him and not to admire him, was it?" "He was a remarkable man," I said, unsteadily. Then, before the appealing fixity of her gaze, fixity of her gaze, that seemed to watch for more words on my lips, I went on. "It was impossible not to love him," she finished eagerly, silencing me in an appalled dumbness. How true, but when you think that no one knew him so well as I had all his noble confidence. I knew him best." "You knew him best," I repeated, "and perhaps she did," but I fancied that with every word spoken the room was growing darker, and only her forehead, smooth and white, remained illuminated by the unextinguishable light of belief and love. "You were his friend," she went on. "His friend," she repeated in a little louder. "You must have been if he had given this to you and sent you to me. I feel I can speak to you. Oh, I must speak. I want you who have heard his last words, to know I have been worthy of him. It is not pride. Yes, I am proud to know I understood him better than anyone on earth," he said to himself. "And since his mother died, I have had no one to the guy that they stole his thing when I came out the gym. I guess he's able to drive it, so I think he just left, but it just sounds very loud. All right, so top of page 93, first paragraph. "I listened. The darkness deepened. I was not even sure whether he had given me the right bundle. I rather suspect he wanted me to take care of another batch of his papers, which after his death I saw the manager examining under the lamp. But in the box I had brought to his bedside there were several packages pretty well alike, all tied with shoestrings, and probably he had made a mistake." And the girl talked, easing her pain in the certitude of my sympathy. She talked as thirsty men drink. I had heard that her engagement with Kurtz had been disapproved generally. He wasn't rich enough for something, and indeed I don't know whether he had not been a pauper all his life. He had given me some reason to infer that it was his impatience of comparative poverty that drove him out there. Who was not his friend who had heard him speak once, she was saying. He drew men towards him by what was best in them. She looked at me with intensity. "It is a gift of the great," she went on, and the sound of her low voice seemed to have the accompaniment of all the other sounds, full of mystery, desolation, and sorrow. I had ever heard the ripple of the river, the sawing of the trees swayed by the wind, the murmurs of wild crowds, the faint ring of Incomprehensible words cried from afar. The whisper of a voice speaking from beyond the threshold of an eternal darkness. But you have heard him, you know, she cried. Yes, I know, I said with something like despair in my heart, but bowing my head before the faith that was in her, before that great and saving illusion that shone with an unearthly glow in the darkness, in the triumphant darkness from which I could not have defended her, from which I could not even defend myself. What a loss to me, to us, she corrected herself with beautiful generosity, then added in a murmur to the world. By the last gleams of twilight, I could see the glitter of her eyes, full of tears that would not fall. I have been very happy, very fortunate, very proud, she went on. Too fortunate, too happy for a little while, and now I am unhappy for life. Too fortunate, too happy for a little while. Now, okay. She stood up. Her fair hair seemed to catch all the remaining light in a glimmer of gold. I rose too. And all of this, she went on mournfully. Of all this promise, and of all his greatness, of his generous mind, of his noble heart, nothing remains, nothing but a memory, you and I. We shall always remember him, I said hastily. No, she cried, it is impossible that all this should be lost, that such a life should be sacrificed to leave nothing but sorrow. You know, he had vast plans, I knew them too, I cannot perhaps understand, but others knew of them. Something must remain, his words at least have not died. His words will remain, I said, and his example, she whispered to herself. Wherever he went, man looked up to him, his goodness shone in every act. His example, sure, I said, his example too, yes. His example, I forgot that. But I cannot believe, not yet, cannot believe that I shall never see him again, and nobody will ever see him again, never, never, never. She put out her arms as if after a retreating figure, stretching them black, and with clasped pale hands across the fading and narrow sheen of the window, never see him. I saw him clearly enough then. I shall see his eloquent phantom as long as I live, and I shall see her too, a tragic and familiar shade resembling in this gesture another one. Tragic also, and bedecked with powerless charms, stretching bare brown arms over the glitter of the infernal stream, the stream of darkness. She said suddenly, very low, he died as he lived. His end, said I, with dull anger stirring in me, was in every way worthy of his life. And I was not with him, she murmured. My anger subsided before a feeling of infinite pity. Everything that could be done, I mumbled. Ah, but I believed in him more than anyone on earth, more than his own mother, more than himself. He needed me. Me, I would have treasured every sigh, every murmur, every word, every sigh, every glance. I felt like a chill grip on my chest. Don't, I said in a muffled voice. Forgive me, I have mourned so long in silence. You were with him to the last. I think of his loneliness. Nobody near to understand him as I would have understood, perhaps no one to hear. To the very end, I said shakily. I heard his very last words. I stopped in a fright. Repeat them, she said in a heartbroken tone. I want something to live with. I was on the point of crying at her. Don't you hear them? The dusk was repeating them in a persistent whisper all around us, in a whisper that seemed to swell menacingly like the first whisper of a rising wind. The horror. His last word to live with, she murmured. Don't you understand? I love them. I pulled myself together and spoke slowly. The last word he pronounced was your name. I heard a light sigh, and then my heart stood still, stopped dead short by an exulting and terrible cry, but the cry of inconceivable triumph and of unspeakable pain. I knew it. I was sure she knew. She was sure. I heard her weeping, her face in her hands. It seemed to me that the house would collapse before I would escape, that the heavens would fall upon my head. But nothing happened. The heavens do not fall for such a trifle. Would they have fallen? I wondered if I had rendered Kurtz that justice which was his due. Hadn't he said he wanted only justice? But I could not tell her. It could have been too dark altogether. Marlowe ceased and sat apart, indistinct and silent, in the pose of a meditating Buddha. Nobody moved for a time. We have lost the first of the ebb. EBB, said the director suddenly. I looked around. The offing was barred by a black bank of clouds and the tranquil waterway leading to the uttermost ends of the earth. Flowed, somber, under an overcast sky, seemed to lead also into the heart of an immense darkness. Marlowe ceased and sat apart, indistinct and silent, in the pose of a meditating Buddha. Nobody moved for a time. We have lost the first of the ebb, said the director. Suddenly I look around. The offing was barred by a black bank of clouds, and the tranquil waterway leading to the uttermost ends of the earth flowed. Somber under an overcast sky, seemed to lead also in the heart of an immense darkness. Damn, this was just like a book of a lot of this author was just like saying a lot of his emotion, huh? I guess how he felt, or I don't know, what kind of writing would you call this? This is comprehensive paperback edition with introduction notes. I feel like I read this before, to be honest with you. But anyway, I guess I had enough on my phone for my phone to be over an hour of this video. But I'm glad I finished this book because it's totally boring. Now I will work on As I Lay Dying after, and then after that I got a surprise. Don't want to keep saying it, but anyway, thank you for tuning in. Appreciate y'all.